Imagine standing in a kitchen where every dish you prepare could decide your fate. The knives are sharp, the flames roar, but the real danger is not in the cooking, it's in the man you serve. For years, he stood just a few steps away from the supreme leader of North Korea, preparing meals no one else was allowed to touch. Every grain of rice, every sip of wine, had to be perfect and safe. He tasted them first, knowing that one mistake, one sign of poison, could mean instant death. But then one day, he disappeared. Not because he failed at his craft, but because he saw something he should never have seen. Something that convinced him the closer you were to the leader, the closer you were to the grave. This is the untold story of the man who fed Kim Jong Un, and then risked everything to flee. He was not born into privilege, nor was he destined for greatness. His story began in an ordinary neighborhood on the outskirts of Pyongyang, where families lived in cramped apartments, and survival meant unquestioned loyalty to the state. From a young age, he discovered a gift for flavors. While other boys dreamed of joining the military, he spent hours watching his mother mix spices, fascinated by how a pinch of salt could transform an entire meal. That talent would soon change his life. The regime was always searching for the rare few who could serve the inner circle. Every candidate was screened with an intensity beyond imagination. Their family histories were traced back 3 generations. Their loyalty to the party had to be spotless. Any hint of untrustworthiness, a cousin who defected, a relative accused of disloyalty would disqualify them instantly. He passed every test. His cooking was precise, his demeanor quiet, his background unblemished. For the authorities, he was the perfect candidate, skilled, obedient, and silent. He was summoned to a training program where chefs were drilled not only in culinary techniques but in discipline. They learned how to present dishes in exact detail, how to maintain composure under surveillance, and above all, how to keep secrets. The day he was chosen to serve in one of Kim Jong Un's private residences felt like a moment of triumph. He was young, ambitious, and filled with pride. His family boasted of his assignment. Neighbors whispered in awe. Very few ever entered the leader's household. Fewer still survived long enough to leave it. Inside the compound, he discovered a world that ordinary North Koreans could never imagine. Imported ingredients filled refrigerators. Kobe beef from Japan. Caviar from Russia. Wines from France. Electricity never failed. The halls gleamed with marble, and the staff moved in hushed silence. To him, it was both dazzling and terrifying. At first, he believed he had achieved the highest honor any citizen could hope for, to serve the supreme leader himself. But honor in North Korea was a fragile thing. The closer he stood to power, the more he began to realize the cost. Life inside the palace kitchen was a paradox. From the outside, it appeared to be paradise. Shelves lined with imported cheeses, chocolates flown in from Switzerland, and barrels of expensive wine stacked in hidden cellars. He had never seen such abundance in a country where most citizens survived on cornmeal and pickled cabbage. Every day began with precision. At dawn, he reported to the kitchen, where a team of chefs worked in silence, their movements practiced like a military drill. Men in dark suits, agents from the security bureau, hovered nearby, inspecting every ingredient that entered the compound. Nothing touched the leader's plate without being examined, washed, and tested. Even the water was checked for toxins. Before each meal, he was required to taste the food himself. A spoonful of broth, a bite of rice, a sip of wine. He would wait for 10 long minutes under the watchful eyes of security officers, his heart pounding as they studied him for any sign of illness. Only after he remained standing, steady and alive, would the dish be served to Kim Jong Un. There were other rituals too. Every month, blood was drawn from the chefs and servants to ensure no one had been poisoned or contaminated. To outsiders, it might sound like paranoia, but inside those walls, it was reality. The leader lived in constant fear of assassination, and the kitchen staff were both his guardians and his potential executioners. In those early years, the chef tried to ignore the weight of it all. He focused on perfecting flavors, slicing fish for sushi with surgical precision, grilling imported beef until it melted on the tongue. Kim Jong Un's tastes were lavish Japanese sushi, Italian pasta, fine cognac, and he expected perfection. A mistake as small as a slightly overcooked steak could spark a glare that froze the entire kitchen. But what unsettled the chef most was not the food, nor the scrutiny, but the man he served. Up close, Kim Jong Un was nothing like the powerful, untouchable figure shown on television. He saw him sweat after meals, gasping for breath, as if climbing a mountain after only a short walk. He saw the leader's swollen hands, the way he rubbed his legs when he thought no one was watching. These glimpses were dangerous. In North Korea, the supreme leader was supposed to be flawless, eternal, almost divine. But the chef knew the truth. The man at the head of the table was mortal, fragile, and deeply afraid. And in that truth lay a secret too dangerous for him to carry forever. It began quietly, as all disappearances did in North Korea. One morning, a fellow chef simply did not report to the kitchen. His knives were still arranged neatly on the rack, his uniform folded on the chair. At first, the others whispered that perhaps he had been transferred. But transfers were announced, and farewells were permitted. This time, there was nothing, just an empty chair at the breakfast briefing. Within hours, the silence in the kitchen thickened like smoke. No one dared to ask questions. The guard's eyes lingered longer than usual, scanning faces for signs of fear. That night, when the young chef returned to his quarters, the bunk across from him was stripped bare, the sheets gone, as if the man had never existed. He knew the truth. The missing chef had once accidentally overseasoned a soup, an error minor to anyone else, but unforgivable when serving the leader. A grim realization spread through him. One mistake, no matter how small, could erase a life without a trace. From that moment, the chef's pride in his position curdled into dread. He worked with trembling hands, second-guessing every dash of spice, every cut of meat. Each day felt like walking across a minefield, knowing that one misstep meant the end. Worse still were the things he could no longer unsee. Kim Jong Un's health was deteriorating before his eyes. The leader's face flushed red after meals heavy with meat, his breathing labored, his ankles swollen. He ordered expensive French cognac by the case, yet sometimes coughed so violently he nearly choked. The contradiction gnawed at the chef. The state portrayed Kim as a god, yet he was cooking for a man whose body betrayed weakness at every turn. And then came the night that sealed his fate. During an extravagant dinner, he caught the leader's eye for a fleeting second. In that gaze, he read suspicion, paranoia so sharp it felt like a blade against his throat. Afterward, a security officer pulled him aside, demanding an additional blood sample. The implication was clear. He was being watched more closely than ever. Sleep abandoned him. Every creak of the floorboards, every knock at the door, felt like the arrival of his own execution. He remembered the vanished chef, the stripped bed, the silence. He imagined his own family erased in the same way. Their names blackened, their lives shattered for his failure. It was in those sleepless nights that he reached his decision. Staying meant waiting to vanish like the others. Leaving meant risking everything. The guards, the borders, the brutal punishment if caught. But it was the only path left. He would escape. He began planning in silence, knowing that one careless word could end not only his life, but also his family's night. Escape from North Korea was not simply a matter of walking away. It was treason, punishable by death. Every step required precision, every decision a gamble. The first challenge was contact. Rumors spoke of brokers, shadowy figures who arranged passages out of the country, charging sums most people could never afford. Through a distant cousin who worked in a supply depot, he whispered inquiries. After weeks of coded exchanges, he finally secured a meeting. The broker's message was chillingly simple. Bring cash. Bring nothing else. Trust no one. He gathered what little wealth he could. In the compound, he had been paid in luxury goods rather than money. Bottles of foreign liquor, boxes of imported cigarettes. Carefully, he traded them on the black market, converting indulgence into survival. Each transaction was a risk. One wrong buyer could denounce him. But desperation gave him courage. On a damp spring night, he slipped from his quarters, carrying only a small satchel. The kitchen, where he had once feared every taste test, now stood silent behind him. Ahead lay the border with China, a river that had swallowed countless souls who tried and failed before him. The journey north was relentless. By day, he hid in abandoned barns, crouched beneath piles of hay, or pressed himself flat in drainage ditches as military trucks rumbled past. By night, he walked. His shoes tore against the jagged earth, and hunger gnawed at him, but he pressed on. At times, he imagined he heard the footsteps of security officers behind him, the echo of pursuit that may or may not have been real. At the river crossing, the air was sharp with the smell of wet earth. The broker whispered final instructions. The patrols changed shifts every 20 minutes. He would have one chance. If he hesitated, he would die. The water was icy, black as ink beneath the moonlight. He slid in quietly, clutching a bundle of reeds to disguise his shape. The current pulled at his body, threatening to drag him under. Every splash seemed too loud, every ripple a beacon for the guards. At one point, a beam of light swept across the surface, freezing his heart. He pressed his face into the water, lungs screaming, until it passed. When he reached the far bank, he collapsed into the mud, shaking, soaked, but alive. China. For the first time, he was outside North Korea, but freedom was still far away. China did not welcome defectors. He was a fugitive there too, hunted by police eager to return him for a reward. For weeks, he moved like a ghost, from safe house to safe house, guided by underground networks of activists and fellow defectors. Sometimes he went days without food, too frightened to step into a shop. Sometimes he slept in forests, his only blanket the thought of what awaited him if he failed. There were close calls. Once, at a rural bus station, plainclothes officers began questioning passengers. His forged papers trembled in his hands as the officer's eyes swept over him. A heartbeat longer, and he might have been caught. But the officer was distracted, waving him through. He did not breathe again until the bus was miles away. Months later, battered and thin, he finally reached the safety of a foreign embassy willing to help him. From there, arrangements were made to bring him to South Korea. The day he boarded the flight, he looked back one final time, knowing he could never return. For years, he had cooked meals for a man who trusted no one. Now, he was free, but his freedom was built on silence. The secrets he carried about the supreme leader's table, his health, his paranoia, those were truths too dangerous to ever fully tell. Yet, even as the plane lifted into the sky, he whispered to himself, "I have escaped. I am alive." When the plane landed in Seoul, he felt as if he had stepped onto another planet. The city glittered with neon signs and glass towers, an ocean of light that burned all night long. For someone who had spent his life in a country where electricity was rationed, the sight was overwhelming. He stood at the airport, blinking, unsure if this was real or a dream. His first night in South Korea was the hardest. In North Korea, silence ruled. The streets were dark, the houses hushed after sunset. But here, the world never slept. Cars hummed along the highways, advertisements flickered, and voices echoed in the streets. He lay awake in his bed, struggling to calm the panic in his chest. The brightness felt unnatural, almost threatening. At the government facility known as Hanawan, where defectors received their first lessons in freedom, he began to learn. They taught him how to use a smartphone, how to open a bank account, how to search the internet. The first time he typed into Google, his hands shook. A universe of information spilled onto the screen, knowledge that had been denied to him his entire life. He wept quietly, realizing how small and controlled his world had once been. Food, too, was a revelation. In Pyongyang, even as a chef for the supreme leader, he had been surrounded by luxury but never permitted to taste freely. Every bite had been watched, measured, tested. Now, in a Seoul supermarket, he wandered aisles lined with endless choices. Tropical fruits, shelves of spices, rows of packaged snacks. He touched everything, unable to believe it was available to anyone with a few bills in hand. Yet the freedom came with shadows. He often looked over his shoulder, haunted by the fear that North Korean agents might be watching. At restaurants, the clatter of plates sometimes made him flinch, as if expecting the bark of a guard. When people laughed loudly on the subway, he wondered if they were laughing at him. The paranoia of years spent under surveillance did not vanish overnight. Still, he began to heal. In cooking classes organized by NGOs, he rediscovered his craft not as a servant of a dictator, but as a creator of joy. For the first time, he cooked dishes of his own choosing and shared them with strangers who thanked him warmly. There were no taste tests for poison, no guards staring over his shoulder, no fear of sudden disappearance. Each day, the distance between his old life and his new one grew wider. He was still cautious, still scarred, but he was beginning to understand something he had never known before: what it meant to live as a free man. Looking back, he often wonders how he managed to survive it all. The kitchens of fear, the nights without sleep, the river that nearly swallowed him whole. He knows others were not so fortunate. Many who stood beside him in the palace vanished without a trace, erased from existence. Sometimes their faces still haunt his dreams. Freedom has not erased the past. The shadows of North Korea linger in his mind, the constant suspicion, the silence that was demanded, the eyes of the leader staring through him. Yet, here, in a land where he can speak freely, he has begun to reclaim his voice. He remembers the nights he stood in front of Kim Jong Un, bowing his head as dishes were presented, terrified that a single error could condemn him. Today, he bows to no one. He cooks not out of fear, but out of love. Each plate he prepares for friends in Seoul, each shared meal, is an act of defiance against the life that once imprisoned him. He knows his journey came at a cost. He left behind family, a homeland, and years of his life that can never be restored. The scars of exile are permanent. But when he walks down the streets of Seoul, surrounded by light and laughter, he feels something priceless stirring within him: dignity. The closer you are to the leader, the more dangerous it gets, he says quietly. But the moment you step away, even if it costs you everything, you begin to live. For him, freedom was not a gift handed to him. It was seized through fear, hunger, and courage. And though it came with loss, it gave him the one thing that no dictator could ever control: the chance to be human again.